It all started with a dare. I mean, of course it did. That's how most dumb decisions begin, right? Mike and I were hanging out on the curb at the end of our street, just killing time when he looked at me with that smirk of his, the one that always meant trouble. "You scared?" he asked, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. I didn't even smoke, but I watched the ember die out, the question hanging in the air like it had weight. "Of what?" I shot back, playing it cool, though I already knew where this was going. Mike was obsessed with that house. We all were, in a way. The old, broken-down place at the end of Elm Street had been empty for as long as I could remember. People said weird things about it, mostly stuff kids make up to scare each other, but still something about it didn't sit right. You know what I'm talking about. The house. Mike jerked his thumb toward it, and even though it was almost sundown, I could still see the outline of it from where we sat. It looked like a dark shadow against the sky, the windows boarded up, and the roof sagging under years of neglect. "I don't know, man," I muttered, trying to act like it was no big deal, but deep down my stomach turned. "It's just an old house." Mike grinned. "Then prove it. Stay there for the night. Just you. One night. And I'll never call you out again." It was a challenge, and we both knew it. If I said no, I'd never live it down. He'd remind me every day how I chickened out. I couldn't have that. Besides, it's not like I actually believed all that haunted house crap. "Fine," I said, shrugging like it didn't bother me. "I'll do it. Easy." Mike slapped my back, laughing. "That's what I'm talking about. Just make sure you don't freak out when the ghosts come for you." I rolled my eyes, but deep down his words left a pit in my stomach. I kept telling myself it was just a house. Old wood, some broken windows, maybe a couple of rats. Nothing else. No ghosts. No weird stories. Just dust and time. But as we walked up the cracked sidewalk, a chill ran down my spine. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the yard, making everything feel colder than it should. The front door of the house was barely hanging on its hinges, and the steps creaked under my feet as I climbed up to the porch. "You sure you want to do this, man?" Mike asked, his tone teasing, but there was a slight hesitation there. Maybe he wasn't as sure as he seemed. I said I'm doing it. I replied, though my voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. "I'll see you in the morning." Mike gave me a thumbs up and backed away, still grinning. "Good luck. Hope the ghosts are friendly." I watched him walk off, his laughter echoing in the distance. And then I was alone. I turned back to the house, standing in front of the door that looked like it had seen better centuries, not just days. I pushed it open, and the sound of the old wood creaking made the hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way the house seemed to sigh, like it was letting me in almost too easily. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was a smell. It was musty like wet earth and rot, the kind of smell that clings to everything. The floorboards creaked beneath my shoes as I moved further in, and every step echoed through the empty rooms, as if the house was trying to remember the sound of life again. There was a thick layer of dust on everything. The furniture, the floors, even the walls. It was like time had stopped here a long time ago, and no one had bothered to look back. I shone my flashlight around the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it didn't make me feel any better. The house was just empty, but it was more than that. It felt wrong, like the walls were watching me, like something had been disturbed the moment I stepped through the door. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. "It's just a house," I muttered to myself, as if saying it out loud would make it true. Nothing but dust and bad plumbing. The stairs loomed ahead, leading to the second floor. That's where I was heading. If I was going to make it through the night, I needed to find a spot to crash and just wait it out. The quicker I got this over with, the sooner I could prove Mike wrong. With one last glance back at the front door, I took a deep breath and started up the stairs. They creaked loudly under my weight, each step sounding like a warning, but I kept going, my flashlight flickering a little as I reached the top. I stood there, looking down the long hallway lined with closed doors. Something about them felt off, but I wasn't about to let some creepy old house get the best of me. The first thing that hit me as I reached the top of the stairs was the silence. It wasn't the normal kind of silence you get in an empty house. This was heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood there for a second, just listening, but there was nothing. No creaks, no wind, Not even the sound of the house settling. It was like I had stepped into a vacuum. I moved my flashlight across the hallway, illuminating the dust-covered floor and the doors on either side. There were 4 of them, 2 on each wall, all closed tight. The light flickered again, and I gave it a sharp tap. The beam steadied, but my pulse didn't. The further I went into this house, the more it felt like it didn't want me here. Just a few more hours, I muttered under my breath. Then I'm out. I decided to check the doors, see if any of them would give me a clue about where I should stay for the night. The first door on my left was stuck, the wood swollen from years of moisture and neglect. I gave it a hard shove, but it barely budged. Behind it, all I could see was darkness, the beam of my flashlight swallowed up by the void. That was a no-go. The next door across the hall opened easily. I stepped inside, shining my light around. It looked like an old guest room, with a dusty twin bed shoved against the far wall and a cracked mirror hanging above an empty dresser. It didn't feel right, though. There was a coldness to the room, not like temperature cold, but more like the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel unwelcome. I stepped back into the hallway, not willing to risk spending the night in there. That room felt wrong. I don't know how else to explain it. Just wrong. The third door, a little further down, opened with a groan, the hinges barely hanging on. This one led to a bathroom. At least it used to be a bathroom. The sink was rusted through, and the bathtub was filled with something dark and murky. The smell coming from it made me gag, so I slammed the door shut and backed away. Definitely not staying there. That left one more door at the very end of the hall. I walked slowly toward it, the sound of my footsteps loud in the stillness. The closer I got, the more the silence pressed in on me, like the house was listening to every movement I made. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was alone. Or at least I thought I was alone. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment. My hand hovered over the doorknob, a sudden wave of anxiety washing over me. Something about this door felt different from the others, like it was waiting for me. "Come on, man, don't be stupid," I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping fear. I grabbed the knob and turned it slowly. The door swung open without resistance, revealing a large bedroom. The light from my flashlight swept across the room, and I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. This room was different from the others. It was cleaner, less dust, less decay. The bed was still intact, with the sheets pulled tight, though they were yellowed with age. There was a dresser along the wall and a big, round mirror hanging above it. That mirror immediately caught my attention. It didn't fit with the rest of the room. While everything else was old and worn, the mirror looked spotless, as if someone had just cleaned it. I stepped into the room, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. As I moved further inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the mirror. It was too perfect, too new. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't put my finger on why, but it gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the way the light hit it, or the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, but it felt like my reflection was just a little too slow to move. I turned away, trying to ignore the weird feeling crawling up my spine. This was the best room I'd found so far. The bed looked sturdy enough, and there weren't any obvious signs of rot or damage. If I was going to make it through the night, this was my best shot. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging slightly beneath me. The room was cold, but it wasn't unbearable. I pulled my backpack off my shoulders and set it on the floor beside the bed, then leaned back against the headboard. I tried to relax, but the silence was still pressing in on me, heavier than ever. It felt like the house was waiting for me to make a move, like it was watching and listening for the slightest sound. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway, soft and slow, like someone speaking just out of reach. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I strained to listen, holding my breath, but the whispering stopped. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe the house settling, or something else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was no wind. There hadn't been any sound at all before that whisper. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No response. Nothing but that suffocating silence. I stood up, my flashlight shaking a little in my hand as I pointed it toward the hallway. The door was still open, the hallway beyond empty and dark. I wanted to check to see if maybe Mike was messing with me somehow, but the thought of leaving the room and stepping into that hallway made my skin crawl. Instead, I stayed where I was, just staring at the open door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The house was still, quiet, watching. I slowly backed away from the door and sat down on the bed again, my eyes still glued to the doorway. Whatever had made that whisper, I didn't want to meet it. I just had to make it through the night. The more time I spent in that room, the more it felt like something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I had checked and rechecked every corner. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder and your skin crawl. I tried to convince myself that it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me. After all, I was sitting in a creepy, old house in the middle of the night. Who wouldn't feel a little on edge? I stood up and walked over to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the street, or maybe Mike hanging around outside, waiting to jump out and scare me. The glass was filthy, covered in grime, so thick I could barely see through it. I wiped at it with my sleeve, but it didn't help much. Outside, the street was completely empty. No Mike, no cars, no sign of life at all. The only thing I could see was the faint glow of the streetlights, but even those felt far away, like I was cut off from the rest of the world. I turned back to the room, and that's when my eyes landed on the mirror again. Something about it was bothering me, more than before. It was still too clean, too polished, like it didn't belong in this decaying house. And now, in the dim light, I could swear there was something wrong with my reflection. It didn't seem right. The room behind me in the reflection looked normal enough, but my face, there was something off about it. My expression seemed strained, my eyes a little too wide, my skin a little too pale. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it. It's just your imagination, I told myself. But even as I said it, I couldn't look away from the mirror. I leaned in closer, staring at my own face, my breath fogging up the glass slightly. The more I looked, the more certain I was that something was wrong. And then it happened, just for a second, so quick I almost thought I imagined it. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. I stared at the mirror, my breathing heavy, trying to figure out if I had really seen what I thought I did. I stood there, frozen, waiting for it to happen again. But the reflection just stared back at me, perfectly still, exactly like it should be. Okay, I muttered, rubbing my face with my hands, trying to shake off the creeping fear that was starting to settle in. You're losing it, man. This is all in your head. I sat back down on the bed, keeping my eyes on the mirror, though every instinct told me to look away. The room felt colder now, like the air itself had thickened. My hands were trembling, and I clenched my fists to steady them. I needed to get a grip. There was nothing here. Just me, some dusty old furniture, and a mirror that was probably playing tricks on me because of the bad lighting. I forced myself to lie down, keeping my back to the mirror, trying to relax. The bed creaked beneath me, the old springs groaning under my weight. I stared up at the ceiling, willing myself to calm down, but the tension in the room wouldn't let go of me. It was like the air itself was pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come and take me out of this weird atmosphere. But that's when I heard it again, the whisper. Only this time, it was clearer. It came from right next to me. Leave! I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes darting around the room. There was no one there. The whisper had been soft, almost like a breath, but it was close. Too close. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I swung it around the room, checking the corners, the door, the window. Everything was exactly as it had been. But that voice, I couldn't have imagined that. I had heard it. I shined the light at the mirror, expecting to see something there, some sign that it wasn't just my imagination. But all I saw was my own face again, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at me. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. My legs felt shaky as I approached the mirror once more. The urge to touch it, to prove to myself that it was just a normal mirror was overwhelming. I reached out and placed my hand on the glass, feeling the cold surface beneath my palm. It was smooth, too smooth for a mirror that should have been covered in grime like everything else in this house. And then, as I stood there, my hand pressed against the glass, I felt it. Something tapped from the other side. It was light, like someone gently knocking from behind the mirror. I yanked my hand away, my heart in my throat. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam flickering as I pointed it at the mirror. I was breathing hard, my eyes locked on the glass, waiting, dreading, for something to happen. Nothing. Just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. I backed up slowly, making my way to the door, never taking my eyes off the mirror. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, pushing me toward that thing. The whispers were gone, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt charged, like the air before a storm. I finally made it to the door and grabbed the handle, ready to bolt out of there. But as I turned it, the knob wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like it had been sealed shut from the other side. Panic surged through me. I yanked harder, the door rattling in its frame, but it refused to open. "Come on," I growled under my breath, pulling with everything I had. But the door wouldn't give. Then, just as I was about to scream in frustration, I heard it again. A whisper, not from the mirror this time, but from behind the door. "Let me in." I stood frozen at the door, my hands still gripping the knob. My heart was pounding so loud. It was the only sound I could hear. But that voice, it was so soft, barely more than a whisper. "Let me in." It was coming from the other side of the door. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I didn't want to open the door, didn't want to see what was waiting for me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The door rattled again, just the slightest shake, as if something or someone was pressing gently against it. The voice, that soft whisper, came again, sending chills down my spine. "Let me in." I yanked my hand off the knob like it was on fire, stumbling back a step. My flashlight flickered again, and in the dim, flickering light, the door creaked open on its own. Just an inch, but enough for me to see the blackness in the hallway beyond. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, like I was breathing through a thick fog. Then from the sliver of the open door, something moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering beam of my flashlight. But this shadow was different. It didn't move with the light. It had a form, a shape, and it slid through the gap in the doorway like smoke pouring into the room. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't like any shadow I had ever seen. It was darker, like a piece of the night had come alive and stepped into the house. It moved slowly, creeping across the floor, as if testing the air. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back further, pressing myself against the wall, my eyes never leaving that thing. It didn't have a shape, not really. It was just darkness. It twisted and curled, but there was something deliberate about its movements, like it knew exactly where it was going. And where it was going was toward me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was too tight, too dry. My hands were shaking so badly that my flashlight slipped from my grip and hit the floor with a dull thud. The light spun wildly across the room, casting erratic shadows on the walls. But none of those shadows were as dark or as terrifying as the one now making its way toward me. I had to move. I had to get out of there. But my body wouldn't listen. It was like the fear had locked me in place, leaving me helpless as the shadow crept closer and closer. Then, just as it reached the edge of the bed, it stopped. The air around me felt like it was being sucked out of the room, the temperature dropping so fast that my breath fogged in the cold. I pressed my back harder against the wall, desperate to put as much distance between me and that thing as I could. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind the shadow, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The shadow shifted, as if disturbed by the noise, and then it rose. Slowly, impossibly, the darkness lifted off the floor, taking shape as it rose. It was still formless, still a mass of swirling blackness, but now it was standing, towering over me. There was no face, no eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, feel it watching me. It was like the air around it was vibrating, pulsing with energy. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I watched, helpless, as the shadow stretched toward me, like it was reaching out for me. The cold around it was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, making my whole body shiver. "Let me in." The whisper was louder now, closer, like it was coming from inside my own head. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted. I don't know how I found the strength, but I pushed off the wall and ran. I didn't care where, just away. The room blurred as I sprinted toward the door, my hands shaking so badly that I fumbled with the knob, yanking it open so hard I nearly tore it off the hinges. I threw myself into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. For a second, everything was still. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, my heart racing out of control. The hallway was just as dark and quiet as before, but somehow it felt safer. As if whatever that thing was couldn't leave the room. I stood there for what felt like hours, just trying to calm down, my mind spinning with what had just happened. My flashlight was still back in the room, but there was no way I was going back in there. Not for anything. But as the adrenaline started to wear off, something else caught my attention. A noise. Footsteps. They were faint, barely more than a whisper of sound. But they were there, coming from the other end of the hallway. I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I realized I wasn't alone. The end of the hallway was shrouded in darkness, but in the dim light, I could just make out a shape, a figure standing in the shadows. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, my pulse quickening. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. "Mike!" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. But there was no answer. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, its outline barely visible in the darkness. And then slowly, it started to move, not toward me, but across the hallway, sliding along the floor like it wasn't even walking. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a person. It was the shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slide across the floor, just like it had in the room, curling and twisting as it moved. It was following me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. My ankle twisted as I hit the bottom step, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to get out. The front door loomed ahead, and I threw myself at it, yanking it open with a force I didn't know I had. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I was out. I was free. I stumbled onto the porch, gasping for breath, my mind still racing. I glanced back at the house, half expecting the shadow to be right behind me. But the doorway was empty. The house was silent. I stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, slowly, I backed away from the house, not daring to take my eyes off it. As I reached the street, I turned and ran, the whispers still echoing in my head. "Let me in." I ran down the street as fast as I could, my legs burning and my lungs screaming for air. The night was cold, but the adrenaline pumping through me was hotter than fire. I didn't dare look back, afraid that if I did, I'd see that shadow standing there at the door, watching me. Or worse, it would be chasing me. The street was completely empty. Every house was dark, every window closed. There were no cars, no people, not even the usual sound of dogs barking or leaves rustling. It was like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I felt completely alone. By the time I reached the corner, my body was giving out. My ankle throbbed from where I'd twisted it on the stairs, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, leaning against a tree to steady myself. "Mike," I panted, looking around, half expecting him to pop out from behind a bush, laughing at how freaked out I was. "Mike, where the hell are you?" But there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. I stood there for a minute, trying to catch my breath, my eyes darting around the dark street. Everything was too quiet, too still. I could still feel the fear crawling under my skin, making my heart race even faster. My brain was trying to make sense of what had just happened back in the house, but none of it seemed real. I mean, a shadow? That couldn't be possible. I must have imagined it. Maybe the darkness and the old house had played tricks on me. Maybe I was just so freaked out that my mind filled in the gaps with something terrifying. But that whisper, I couldn't explain that. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of that voice. It hadn't just been in my head. I heard it clear as day. And then there was the mirror, my reflection. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I'd seen it blink. I wasn't losing it. There was something real in that house. As I stood there trying to calm down, I realized something. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No distant traffic, no hum of power lines, not even the wind. The silence was suffocating, like the entire world had gone still. I had to find Mike. I had to tell him what happened, figure this out. He couldn't have gone far. Maybe he was messing with me. Maybe he was waiting around the next corner, watching me freak out. Mike! I called out again, louder this time. My voice echoed down the empty street, but there was no answer. The sound of my voice felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the silence that surrounded me. I started walking again, limping slightly, trying to ignore the throb in my ankle. Every step felt like it was taking me further away from safety, but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I had to keep moving. I had to find Mike. As I turned the corner, I finally saw something. Ahead of me, just beyond the next block, was a streetlight. It flickered weakly, casting a pale, yellow glow onto the pavement below. And standing under that streetlight, I saw a figure. My heart jumped into my throat. I stopped in my tracks, squinting through the darkness. Was it Mike? Mike! I called out, my voice shaky. Is that you? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, bathed in the flickering light, its face hidden in shadow. Something wasn't right. My gut twisted, warning me to stay back. But my feet were already moving, carrying me toward the figure. I had to know. I had to see who or what it was. As I got closer, the streetlight flickered again, and for just a split second, the figure's face was illuminated. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Mike. It was me. My reflection. My face, my body, my clothes, everything. But the eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too empty. The lips were twisted into a strange, eerie smile that I knew didn't belong to me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my body trembling, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. I was looking at myself, but it wasn't me. The figure, my reflection, raised a hand and waved, that twisted smile still plastered on its face. Come back, it said, in a voice that was too familiar. It was my voice. Come back to the house. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. But there it was, standing under the streetlight, staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. The smile never wavered. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the pain in my ankle, didn't care about the burning in my lungs. I just ran. I sprinted down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs shaking with fear and exhaustion. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except getting as far away from that thing as possible. As I ran, the whispers came back. Come back! Come back! They echoed in my head, growing louder with every step. It was the same voice, my voice, calling me back to the house. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just in my ears. They were in my mind, filling my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I turned another corner and nearly collapsed in relief. Mike's house was just up ahead, the porch light on, shining like a beacon in the darkness. I sprinted toward it, my legs shaking, my lungs burning. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Come back. You can't leave. I reached the front door and pounded on it with both fists, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Mike! I shouted, my voice hoarse and desperate. Mike, open the door. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head, wrapping around my mind like cold fingers. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get inside, had to escape. Finally, the door swung open, and there stood Mike, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. Dude, what the hell? He started, but I didn't let him finish. I pushed past him, stumbling into the safety of his house, slamming the door shut behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. The whispers stopped the moment the door closed. leaving an eerie silence in their place. Mike knelt down next to me, his brow furrowed. "Bro, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared up at him, my body trembling. I wanted to tell him everything. The house, the shadow, the reflection, the whispers, but the words wouldn't come. All I could say was, "Don't make me go back." I sat on the floor of Mike's living room, my back pressed against the couch, still trying to catch my breath. My entire body felt like it had been through hell. My ankle was throbbing, my chest heaving, and every muscle was tense like I was waiting for something terrible to happen at any second. But the worst part was the silence that had settled in. The house was quiet, too quiet, and after those whispers had been pounding in my head, the absence of sound felt wrong, almost unsettling. Mike sat down across from me on the coffee table, his eyes searching my face for some kind of explanation. I could tell he didn't know what to make of me. I mean, why would he? I probably looked like a complete mess. "Dude," he started slowly. "What happened back there? You look like you saw a ghost or something." I didn't know where to start. Everything that had just happened in the last hour felt so surreal, like some horrible nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The house, the shadow, the whispers, and worst of all, that thing under the streetlight that had my face. None of it made sense. I opened my mouth to try to explain, but the words felt jumbled in my head. How could I tell him everything without sounding completely insane? I don't even know. I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. Something's wrong with that house, man." Mike raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. He just watched me, waiting for me to continue. I could see he wanted to laugh it off, to tell me it was all in my head, but he didn't. And for that, I was grateful. "I heard things," I said, running a hand through my hair, trying to steady myself. "There was this whisper, like someone was talking to me, but there was no one there. And then there was this shadow. I don't know what it was, Mike, but it wasn't normal. It followed me. It wanted me to let it in." Mike frowned, leaning forward slightly. "A shadow? Like a person?" "No, not a person," I said quickly. "It was just dark, like it was made out of the night itself. It didn't have a face or a body. It was just there, and it was coming for me." Mike's frown deepened, but I could see him trying to make sense of what I was saying. I could tell he wanted to believe me, but at the same time, it sounded crazy. Hell, I didn't even believe what I was saying, and I had seen it. "And that's not the worst part," I said, my voice dropping lower. "When I ran out of the house, I saw something under the streetlight. It looked like me, but it wasn't. It had my face, Mike. It waved at me, and it told me to come back to the house." Mike stared at me for a long time, his eyes wide, trying to process everything I was telling him. I could see the disbelief flickering in his expression, but he wasn't saying anything. He just kept looking at me, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to figure out what to say. After what felt like forever, he finally spoke. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, I'm serious. I don't know what's going on, but there's something wrong with that place. I can feel it, and whatever's in there, it doesn't want us to leave." Mike stood up and started pacing the room, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to make sense of it all. "I mean, I've heard the stories, sure. People say the house is haunted, but nobody's ever actually seen anything, right? It's just old town rumors." "This isn't a rumor, Mike," I said, my voice rising with urgency. "I saw it. I heard it, and I'm not going back there." Mike stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes serious now. Okay, I believe you, man. I don't know what's going on, but I believe you." For a second, relief washed over me. At least I wasn't alone in this anymore. But before I could say anything else, the lights in the living room flickered. Just once for a split second, but long enough to make both of us freeze. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I glanced over at Mike, who looked just as spooked as I felt. You saw that too, right?" Mike asked, his voice shaky. Before I could answer, the lights flickered again, this time longer, leaving the room in darkness for several seconds before they buzzed back to life. The air in the room felt heavier now, almost like it had in the house. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating. Something wasn't right. Then we heard it, the whisper. It was faint, so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it. But the look on Mike's face told me he had heard it too. Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my stomach dropping. It was the same whisper I had heard back in the house. That same soft, eerie voice. "I think it's coming from the front door," Mike said, his voice shaking. We both turned to face the door, and as we did, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was the same words over and over. "Let me in." Mike took a step back, his face pale. "What the hell, man? Is this a joke? Is this part of the dare?" "I wish it was," I muttered, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper continued, growing louder and louder, until it felt like it was filling the entire room. It was surrounding us, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My head was spinning, my heart racing. Then, without warning, the door rattled. We both jumped back, staring at the door as the knob twisted slightly, just like it had back in the house. Something was trying to get in. "Dude," Mike breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered back, my throat tight with fear. "But we need to get out of here." Before either of us could move, the door rattled harder, the knob twisting violently now. The whispers were deafening, echoing around us like a chorus of voices. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place by the fear that had taken hold of me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The door was still. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Mike and I exchanged a look, neither of us daring to speak. Whatever was out there, it was waiting, and it wasn't going to give up. The silence that followed the whispering was almost worse than the noise. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every small sound. Our breathing, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the house settling. But none of that mattered because all I could focus on was the door. We both stared at it, waiting for something to happen. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline still rushing through me. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound, afraid that whatever was outside would hear us and come crashing through. Mike was standing next to me, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. For the first time, he wasn't trying to crack a joke or act tough. He was just as scared as I was. After what felt like an eternity, Mike finally broke the silence. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet, it sounded deafening. "Do you think it's gone?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We need to get out." He nodded, his eyes flicking back to the door as if he expected it to burst open at any moment. What if it's waiting for us out there? I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew was that staying here wasn't an option. Whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted, it wasn't going to stop. I could feel it, lingering in the air like a heavy fog pressing in on us. It wanted us to open that door, to let it in, but I knew if we did, there'd be no going back. I took a deep breath, trying to think. Maybe we can go out through the back. There's got to be a way out without going through the front door. Mike looked at me, his expression uncertain. "Yeah, maybe, but what if it knows? What if it's waiting for us at the back door too?" I didn't want to think about that. The idea that this thing could be everywhere, that it could anticipate our moves, was too much. I just had to believe that there was still a way out. There had to be. I stood up slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. "Come on, let's check it out." Mike followed me as we crept through the house, moving as quietly as we could. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening with each step. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of their presence still hung around us like a bad dream that refused to fade. We reached the kitchen, and I spotted the back door. It looked just like the front, old, weathered, with a simple lock. I reached for it cautiously, glancing back at Mike. He nodded, his face set in a grim expression, ready for whatever was about to happen. I turned the knob slowly, praying that the door wouldn't be locked or jammed. To my relief, it opened with a soft creak, revealing the backyard. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. We could get out. We could run, leave this nightmare behind. But as I stepped outside, something caught my eye. There, at the edge of the yard, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I could see enough to know that it wasn't Mike. My blood ran cold. It was me. The same reflection I'd seen under the streetlight. My own face, my own body, but something was off. The eyes were wrong, dark and hollow, like they had seen something terrible and wanted me to see it too. And that smile, that twisted, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Mike," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Look." He followed my gaze, and I heard his breath catch in his throat. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered back, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "But it's not me." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, that eerie smile never fading. I could feel its eyes on me, even though they were just dark pits. It was like looking into a mirror, but this mirror showed something wrong, something broken. And then it spoke. "Come back." The voice was mine, exactly mine, but hearing it from that thing made my stomach churn. It wasn't just calling me back to the house. It was calling me back to something darker, something I didn't understand. Mike grabbed my arm, his voice low and urgent. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, my eyes still locked on the figure. I didn't know what it wanted, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. We turned and bolted through the yard, running toward the side gate. My legs were screaming, my ankle throbbing with every step, but I didn't care. I was needed to get away from that thing. But as we ran, the whispers started again. This time, they weren't just in my head. They were all around us, swirling in the air like a storm of voices. "Come back, come back." I could hear my own voice in the whispers, echoing over and over, pleading with me to return to the house. It was like the night itself was pulling at me, trying to drag me back. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like invisible hands clawing at my skin. Mike was ahead of me, running faster than I could with my injured ankle, but I could see the fear on his face. He didn't say anything, but I knew he was hearing it too. The whispers, the voices, they were after both of us now. We reached the gate, and Mike threw it open. We tumbled out into the street, gasping for air, our hearts racing. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped. The night was silent again. We stood there, panting, looking back at the house. From where we were, it looked normal, just an old, run-down place sitting at the end of a quiet street. No sign of the shadow, no sign of the figure with my face. But I knew better. "I'm not going back," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "I don't care what happens. I'm never going back there." Mike didn't argue. He just nodded, his face pale. Yeah, man. Me neither." We stood there in the street for a long time, neither of us daring to move, as if we were afraid that if we turned our backs, the house would come alive and drag us back inside. I could still feel the weight of it, like it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up, to give in. And deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in that house, whatever had followed me out, it wasn't done with me yet. The whispers might have stopped, but they weren't gone. And neither was the shadow. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still with me. Even after I left, after Mike and I had run as far from it as we could, the weight of it hung over me like a dark cloud. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake in bed, listening for the whispers. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I kept expecting to see that shadow at the foot of my bed or hear that voice in my ear again. Mike and I didn't talk about it much after that night. We didn't have to. It was always there, unspoken between us, like a shadow following us wherever we went. Whenever we crossed paths on the street, we just nod at each other, a silent understanding that we'd both been through something no one else could ever understand. Something we didn't want to remember, but I couldn't forget. No matter how hard I tried, the house wouldn't let me. It started small at first, just little things, dreams mostly. In them, I was always back in that house, standing in that hallway, hearing the whispers again. The dreams were vivid, so real that I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But every time, I told myself it was just a nightmare, that it couldn't hurt me. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. I bolted upright in bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My room was dark, but there was just enough moonlight streaming in through the window for me to see that my bedroom door was open. I knew I had closed it before I went to bed. I always did, My pulse quickened, and I sat there frozen listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. And then I heard it. Come back! It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. My voice calling me, the same voice that had followed me from that house. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to get out of bed, moving slowly, as if not to disturb whatever was lurking in the shadows. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a baseball bat I kept under my bed, and crept toward the door. My hand shook as I gripped the knob, but when I stepped into the hallway, everything was still, silent. I walked down the hall, my body tense, my ears straining for any sound. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my mind racing. The whispers hadn't come from inside my house. They were outside, out there in the night. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it made my skin crawl. I had to go back to the house. Part of me knew that it would never stop until I did. The house had left something inside me, some piece of darkness that wouldn't let go until I returned. I didn't know why it wanted me back. Maybe it needed me. Maybe it was something worse. But one thing was certain. It wouldn't stop calling until I answered. Grabbing my jacket and my flashlight, I headed out the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The streets were eerily quiet, just like they had been the night it all started. As I made my way toward the end of Elm Street, the familiar dread settled over me again. That same cold, heavy feeling that had followed me ever since that night. The house loomed ahead, just as dark and foreboding as before. It stood at the end of the street, like a black hole, pulling everything into its shadow. The windows were still boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I stopped at the edge of the yard, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had started again, soft at first, barely audible. But as I stood there, staring at the house, they grew louder. Louder and more insistent. Come back, come back. I didn't want to go in, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever was inside, whatever had started that night, it needed to end. I had to face it. My legs felt heavy as I walked up the front steps, each one creaking under my weight. The door was open just enough for me to slip inside. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, and stepped over the threshold. The house was exactly the same as I had left it, cold, dark, and silent. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay clung to everything. I shone my flashlight around, sweeping it across the familiar hallway, the stairs, the peeling wallpaper. But the feeling was different now. Before, the house had felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Now it felt like it was welcoming me back. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. They weren't coming from one place anymore. They were everywhere, surrounding me, filling the house. Come back, come back. I made my way to the staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I knew the source of the whispers was upstairs. The room I had stayed in that night, the one with the mirror, was calling me. My legs shook as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I saw it. The door to the bedroom was open. My flashlight flickered as I stepped into the room. It looked the same as before, the old bed, the cracked mirror, the dusty furniture. But something was different. The air was thicker, colder, and the whispers were louder now, almost deafening. And then I saw it. Standing in front of the mirror was the figure, my reflection. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was me. The figure turned slowly, its dark eyes locking onto mine. The smile was still there, that same twisted, knowing smile that had haunted me ever since that night. It didn't say anything. It didn't have to. I knew what it wanted. It was me. I wasn't supposed to leave that night. The house had let me go, but not all of me. The shadow, the whispers, the figure, it had taken something from me, something it wasn't done with. And now it was time to finish what had started. The figure stepped toward me, and I couldn't move. My body felt like it was made of stone, frozen in place as it came closer. The whispers swirled around me, louder and louder, until they were all I could hear. Come back, come back. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against mine. And in that moment, everything clicked into place. The house wasn't haunted by some spirit or ghost. It wasn't cursed. It was me. I was the one haunting it, the one who never really left. And now I was back. As the figure and I stood there, face to face, the whispers finally stopped. The house went silent. And for the first time, I understood. I was never supposed to leave. I was always a part of this house. And now, I always would be.